Did God fail Adam and Eve? A critique of God's role in the Garden of Eden. 1. Unfair expectations of Adam and Eve. God placed Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and explicitly forbade them from eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Genesis 2. However, they were created without the knowledge of good and evil, which is precisely the knowledge they needed to understand the moral weight of obedience or disobedience. Expecting Adam and Eve to fully grasp the consequences of their actions without such knowledge is akin to expecting a baby to understand complex moral principles. Their disobedience, then, was less a willful rebellion and more the inevitable outcome of their innocence and ignorance. 2. Placing temptation within their reach. God not only allowed the tree of the knowledge of good and evil to exist, but placed it in the center of the garden. Genesis 2. 9. Where it was unavoidable and constantly visible. This deliberate placement raises serious questions. Why would an omniscient and omnibenevolent God create a temptation that his creations, lacking full understanding, were bound to encounter and struggle to resist? Worse, God allowed the serpent, a cunning and deceptive being, to roam freely in the garden and directly interact with Eve. Genesis 3. 1. The serpent's presence turned an already precarious situation into a moral and spiritual trap for Adam and Eve. 3. Failure to educate. Adam and Eve were instructed not to eat the fruit, but God did not explain why or what the consequences of disobedience would entail beyond the vague warning, "You shall surely die." Genesis 2. This lack of clear explanation left room for the serpent to exploit their ignorance, leading Eve to believe that eating the fruit might bring wisdom and divine likeness. Genesis 3. By withholding critical knowledge, God effectively set the stage for their failure. If God's intention was to test their obedience, the test was inherently flawed, as they lacked the necessary understanding to make an informed choice. 4. Severe punishment for an inevitable mistake. After Adam and Eve ate the fruit, God expelled them from Eden, cursed the ground they would work, and introduced pain, toil, and mortality into human existence. Genesis 3, 16-19. This punishment seems disproportionate to the offense, especially considering their lack of knowledge and the deceptive circumstances that led to their disobedience. Moreover, this punishment extended not only to Adam and Eve, but to all their descendants, creating a legacy of suffering for an act committed by two individuals who were fundamentally unequipped to resist temptation. 5. A questionable definition of love. The narrative raises significant questions about the nature of God's love. A truly loving parent would protect their children from harm, educate them about dangers, and guide them with patience. Yet God placed Adam and Eve in harm's way, allowed them to be deceived, and then punished them harshly for failing a test they could not fully comprehend. If God's love is perfect, why does it seem conditional, reactive, and punitive in this story? The act of clothing Adam and Eve, Genesis 3:21, is often cited as an act of care, but it comes after inflicting irreversible consequences upon them and their descendants. 6. Why create the tree at all? Perhaps the most fundamental question is why God created the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the first place. If God's intention was to protect Adam and Eve from harm, the tree's existence and its placement in the garden served no apparent purpose other than to test them. An omniscient God would have foreseen the outcome, making the test seem unnecessary and the resulting suffering avoidable. This raises the ethical question: is it just for an all-powerful being to knowingly create a situation where failure is almost inevitable, only to punish that failure severely? 7. The role of free will. Defenders of the narrative often argue that the tree and the serpent were necessary to give Adam and Eve free will. However, true free will requires the ability to make an informed choice. Without the knowledge of good and evil, Adam and Eve's decision was not truly free. It was the uninformed action of beings who did not yet understand morality. If God valued free will, why not grant them the knowledge of good and evil first, so they could make an informed decision about obedience? Conclusion: a God who fails his creation. The story of the Garden of Eden, when examined critically, portrays a God whose actions appear inconsistent with omnibenevolence and perfect justice. By placing Adam and Eve in a situation where they were bound to fail, failing to educate them, allowing a deceiver into the garden, and punishing them disproportionately. God's actions can be seen as setting up his creation for failure. Far from reflecting perfect love and justice, the narrative raises profound questions about the nature of divine responsibility and whether humanity's so-called fall was truly their fault or a consequence of God's flawed setup. This critique invites readers to reconsider the traditional interpretation of the story and engage with its deeper philosophical and ethical implications.